Season 3 makes no sense at all if you have not seen Season 2. That's obvious, right? Well, here's our latest conundrum. What if Season 3 is now available for viewing and you can't remember Season 2? And the other night, as my husband Doug and I excitedly settled in to watch the newly released Season 3 of The Kaminsky Method. Now, some of you may know that's starring Michael Douglas and Alan Arkin in their later years. It soon became clear that we had missed something. Wait a minute, Norman is dead? No, that can't be, we'd remember that. But look, they're all at his funeral. Oh, wait a second. Let's go back to the last episode of Season 2. Let's do that. Well, Norman's alive there. Long and confusing story short, we ended up watching the last 2 episodes of Season 2 so that we could refresh our memories and feel a little bit more confident before embarking on Season 3. No, that's not like a post-retirement thing. That's not like what we do usually. That Season 2 was pre-COVID, and that was a lifetime ago. So, when's the last time you read 1 Kings? We've heard it for a couple of Sundays. Now, I don't know about you, but it's been at least since pre-COVID for me. Pre-retirement, for sure. And when I thought about it, I was thinking maybe even seminary? Our passage this morning is a little like being given Season 3 with little knowledge or memory of Season 2. And the background is important enough that I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis of the events leading up to our 3rd verse, which Lee read this morning in 1 Kings, which begins, "So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established." You see, Solomon had a half-brother named Adonijah. And Adonijah thought that he should be king. And while their dad was on his deathbed, Adonijah decided to go ahead and crown himself king, and he gathered up a bunch of important folks like priests and army commanders and declared himself king. And he hosted a big giant celebration and invited all the people he could think of, except for Solomon and some of Solomon's allies. Now, Solomon's mother, this does sound like a series, doesn't it? Solomon's mother, King David's wife, Bathsheba, found out. And she went to her husband, King David, on his deathbed and said, "Hey, you promised me that Solomon would be king." And David remembered, and he agreed, and he crowned Solomon right away with a much bigger and louder celebration. Then, as David's time of death drew near, he summoned Solomon to his bedside. He reviewed the political events of the recent past and basically said to him, "You'll know what to do." So you'll notice that our passage this morning, and it was suggested by the lectionary for this Sunday, starts with King David's death and skips right to God's appearing to his son, now King Solomon, in a dream. Well, in between his father's death and Solomon's dream, we're missing some 34 verses in which Solomon orders executions, worships in verboten places, and marries the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. Because how else do you form an alliance with an historic enemy? So biblical scholars and commentators can only surmise Solomon's state of mind when he goes off to Gibeon, maybe on retreat, to offer sacrifices to the Lord. But there does seem to be some concurrence among them, that Solomon knew at some level that his inexperienced leadership style so far was not going to lead him to success, nor his people. Julian de Chazier, who is the senior minister of the University Church in Chicago, writes that at this point, Solomon already had a little bit of wisdom. He writes this: at some point, Solomon realizes that he's been managing everything in the wrong order. And while most leaders would be in too deep to admit their errors, Solomon is at least meek enough to wake up to his errors and seek a new way. This alone, he writes, is proof that Solomon already has a bit of wisdom. Now, during my process of refamiliarizing myself with 1 Kings, reviewing past episodes, as it were, I came across several commentaries that characterizes the wisdom of Solomon as strictly applying to fair and just administration. One dating back to 1871 reads that the wisdom that was asked and obtained was not so much of the heart as of the head. It was wisdom not for himself personally, but for his office, such as would qualify him for the administration of justice, the government of a kingdom, and for the attainment of general scientific knowledge. Even a piece written as recently as 2012 states, and I quote, that the first and most obvious key point of the passage is the need for leaders to seek wisdom. Beyond that, the rest of us should use this passage as direction to examine our leadership candidates with a discerning eye. Now, you might remember that 2012 was also an election year. But my friends, this morning, I'm going to suggest to you, much the same way that the Apostle Paul did in the piece of the letter to Ephesians that we just heard a little earlier, that we can and should apply this passage personally. We are all leaders. Now, you may not see yourself quite that way. You may not be a leader of a geopolitical jurisdiction, or a corporation, or a department therein. You may not chair a committee, or a neighborhood association, or even the annual meeting downstairs. You might not even lead your own book group discussion. But if you're a parent, you are leading your family. And this morning, I think we can quite simply also acknowledge that, at least for the most part, we are leaders of our own lives. God says to Solomon, "Ask what I should give you." And we think of that genie with the wishes 3. But already in his short tenure, Solomon realizes that he needs more. He needs more than the throne, more than the power marriage, more than the adoration of millions, more even than a full treasury. He asks for an understanding mind, or in the translation that Lee read, a discerning mind, and the ability to discern between good and evil. An understanding mind and the ability to discern between good and evil. Now, Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann writes that a closer translation, so we heard understanding mind in the translation I read, discerning heart, I think, in the one we heard earlier. Brueggemann says listening heart, a listening heart. Now, granted, Solomon asked for wisdom, all for the purpose of governing God's great people. But can we not ask for the same wisdom to govern our own lives? God renames the request in response to Solomon as the understanding to discern what is right. And dictionaries define wisdom as the quality of having experience plus knowledge plus good judgment, or the knowledge of what is true or right coupled with just judgment as to action. One source says wisdom is the practical ability to make consistently good decisions in life. Now, I've defined it for myself in a number of ways. One category is based on biting our tongues. Wisdom is knowing when to keep your mouth shut when we disagree with our adult children's parenting practices. Wisdom is deftly steering the family conversation away from divisive politics. Wisdom is having the patience to wait for our turn to speak and not interrupt. But where one category of wisdom may be based in biting one's tongue, another is the wisdom of knowing when to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's dangerous. Addressing the racist remark on the spot. Defending the poor. Defending the poor. Calling, writing, pounding in the lawn, signs reflecting our raised voices for justice on behalf of the silent oppressed and for the overdue healing of a seriously ailing planet. So wisdom is knowing when to keep quiet and when to speak up. Wisdom is knowing if, when, and how to take action. Wisdom is knowing when we need help and admitting it and reaching out to find it, and recognizing that need in others and jumping in to offer whatever we can. Professor Cameron Howard of Luther Seminary wrote that leadership, be it governmental, religious, or otherwise, and here I would add personal, requires us to hold intention, humility, and confidence, finitude, and limitless capacity, the gifts we have and the gifts we have yet to acquire. This holding intention is especially difficult during the complex time in which we live. Our purchasing decisions may exploit children on the other side of the world. Our diets impact the temperature of the oceans. The same social media platforms that allow us to joyfully connect with distant loved ones are the same social media platforms that may be adding to mass misinformation. We hold intention, good and evil, all the time. Wisdom requires responsibility. Wisdom is knowing that we don't have all the answers and that we've made mistakes, that we've hurt people, and that the best way to grow in wisdom is relying upon and asking our infinitely wise and generous God at every step, in every moment. God, grant me the wisdom I need right now to make this very difficult decision, to answer this challenging email, to discipline my child lovingly, to dismiss this employee in a fair and just way, to calmly tell my partner how I really feel. As Solomon asked, may we be meek enough to ask, God, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind, a listening heart, a discerning heart, able to discern between good and evil. May God grant each one of us the wisdom of Solomon in this season and every season. Amen.